Chapter 1. Remnants of Hope. The sky above Sector 4 cracked open, exposing a bleeding wound in reality. It was not merely a storm. It was the weeping sore of the Empyrean dripping madness onto the muddy trenches below. For weeks, the skies of Validia had been a tapestry of bruised purples and sickly greens, but tonight they turned the color of dried blood. Artillery shells screamed through the acid rain, their detonations acting as a heartbeat for a dying world. The ground shook violently, not from tectonic shifts, but from the relentless pounding of heavy ordnance churning the soil into a slurry of mud, metal, and pulverized bone. General Vorenus Hale gripped the damp concrete of the bunker's viewing slit until his leather gloves creaked under the strain. Through the magnified lens of his electro-binoculars, he watched the folly unfold with a sickening sense of inevitability. A platoon of young officers, bright-eyed and foolish with the imperial creed, led a desperate countercharge into the teeth of the enemy. Among them was a silhouette he knew too well. Lieutenant CA-78, his own blood, his son. The boy raised a chainsword, a speck of silver, against the encroaching tide of rusted iron and writhing flesh. Then the heavy bolter fire from the Chaos lines erupted, turning the heroic charge into a fine red mist. There was no glory in the disintegration. One moment a sun, the next wet scraps of meat scattered across the cratered no man's land. The acid rain, relentless and indifferent, began to sizzle against the fresh carnage, blurring the unit insignias on the fallen before they could even be recorded by the servitors. Hale did not scream. The sound died in his throat, choked by the thick copper taste of the air. Around him, the command bunker buzzed with the chaotic static of dying Vox channels, the screams of the wounded, merging with the rhythmic thud of Earthshaker cannons. The smell of burning promethium and roasted human fat drifted in through the ventilation, a nauseating incense for a funeral no one had time to hold. General Command requests a status update on the counter-offensive. A Vox officer stammered, his face pale under the flickering lumen strips. He held the receiver out as if it were a venomous snake. Hale turned slowly, his eyes hollowed out, devoid of the fiery zeal expected of an Imperial commander. He looked at the tactical map now, a sea of red warning runes indicating total breach. The silence that radiated from him was heavier than the bombardment outside. "I do not care for glory, Hale," whispered his voice, cracking like dry parchment, yet cutting through the din of the bunker with terrifying clarity. He grabbed the Voxcaster by the collar, pulling the trembling man close, his eyes burning with a mixture of grief and defiance. "I only want them to survive. Issue the order. General retreat. Pull back to the secondary line. Do it now." The order went out, a ripple of despair across the Voxnet. It was not a tactical withdrawal. It was an admission of defeat. Men threw down heavy stubbers to run faster. Chimeras reversed over their own dead in a desperate bid to escape the encroaching shadows. The defense of Sector 4 collapsed like a rib cage crushed under the weight of a giant. As Hale walked away from the viewing slit, leaving the ghost of his son behind in the mud, the defensive lines broke completely. Validia was not just bleeding, it was being butchered. And in the distance, something ancient and terrible began to laugh in the howling wind. Chapter 2. The Stranger from the Mist. The retreat was not a maneuver. It was a stampede. The mist that rolled over the lowlands of Sector 4 was thick, composed of equal parts chemical smog, vaporized coolant from destroyed tanks, and the chilling breath of the warp. Through this gray purgatory, the soldiers of the Valedian 88th ran. They had cast aside their laser guns, their heavy packs, and their dignity. Terror was the only officer left in command, whipping them forward with the promise of a gruesome death if they lingered. The mud sucked at their boots, pulling them down, as if the planet itself wanted to swallow them whole before the enemy could. Amidst this river of panicked flesh and mud, a single stone stood against the current. He stood near the intersection of two supply roads, a solitary figure shrouded in a coat of archaic cut, colored a dusty, faded gray that seemed alien against the drab olive of the Imperial Guard flak armor. Thomas Jackson did not run. He did not crouch. He stood with a spine of iron, watching the rout with eyes that were not angry, but profoundly disappointed. In his left hand, he held a pair of electro-binoculars. In his right, he idly thumbed the hammer of a kinetic stub revolver, a weapon that looked like a relic from a museum on holy Terra. A young corporal, his face smeared with grease and blood, nearly collided with the motionless figure. The boy scrambled to regain his footing, his eyes wide with the madness of the front lines. He saw an old man unarmored, standing exposed in the killing zone. "Run, old man," the corporal screamed, his voice shredding in his throat. "They're coming. The shadows are eating the rear guard. Move or die." He grabbed at Jackson's coat, trying to pull him into the flight, but the fabric did not budge. The man was rooted to the spot, immovable as a mountain peak. Jackson did not look at the enemy. He looked down at the corporal. The silence that surrounded him was a vacuum sucking in the noise of the artillery and the screams of the dying. Slowly, deliberately, Jackson raised the revolver. He did not point it at the enemy, nor at the soldier. He simply checked the cylinder. Click. The sound was small, mechanical, and precise. It cut through the panic like a scalpel. "Stand up," Jackson said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, resonant rumble devoid of fear, devoid of excitement. It was the sound of absolute certainty in an uncertain universe. The corporal froze. Other soldiers, sensing the sudden break in the flow of the retreat, stumbled to a halt, crashing into one another. They looked at the stranger, confused by his calm. But the order, the corporal stammered, pointing back into the mist where the crimson muzzle flashes of chaos bolters were getting closer. "General Hale ordered a retreat. We are saving ourselves." Jackson finally looked up, his pale blue eyes piercing through the fog to the silhouettes of the approaching horrors. He turned back to the men, his expression unreadable. "Fear is also an order." Jackson stated the words hanging heavy in the damp air. "And I do not issue that order." He holstered the revolver and pointed a gloved finger at a waist-high ridge of rubble nearby. "You men will form a line there. You will stop running. You will aim. And you will wait for my command. We are not going anywhere." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact so absolute that the soldiers found themselves obeying before their minds could process the suicide of it. The rout ended here. The stone wall had been erected. Chapter 3. 2. Ideologies. The interrogation room within the depths of the command bunker was a box of sterile misery. A single strip of lumen light flickered rhythmically above, casting stroboscopic shadows against the cold ferrocrete walls. The air recycler wheezed in the corner, a dying mechanical lung that did little to scrub the acrid stench of ozone and stale sweat from the recycled air. Thomas Jackson sat at the riveted metal table, his gloved hands folded neatly before him. He did not look like a prisoner awaiting judgment. He looked like a guest waiting for a delayed appointment with a subordinate. Opposite him, General Vorenus Hale paced the small room, his boots clicking nervously on the grate. The general looked aged beyond his standard years, the weight of the retreat etching deep canyons of exhaustion into his face. "There is no tea." Hale said, his voice heavy with weariness, dismissing Jackson's polite request with a wave of his hand. He dropped a heavy data slate onto the table. It slid across the metal surface, stopping inches from Jackson's hands. It contained the field reports of Jackson's unauthorized rally at the crossroads, a tactical miracle that Hale viewed as a dangerous anomaly. "This is not a parlor game, and you are not a simulation instructor from the Schola Progenium." Do you understand what you are facing? These aren't rebels or generic Xenos. They are things that defy the laws of physics. They are nightmares given form. Hale looked at the older man, not with contempt, but with a profound, aching pity. To him, Jackson was a relic, a madman trying to fight a hurricane with a slide rule. Jackson remained unmoved by the description of cosmic horrors. He picked up an empty metal cup from the table, inspecting it as if checking for dust, his demeanor eerily calm amidst the emotional storm radiating from the general. "I have seen men run from many things," General Jackson spoke softly, his accent clipped and archaic. "But they run fastest when their leaders provide them the path to do so." He set the cup down with a sharp clack that sounded like a gunshot in the small room. He looked up, locking eyes with Hale. He saw the grief swimming in the general's iris, the fresh bleeding wound of a lost son, and he offered a nod of solemn respect for the pain, but absolutely none for the strategic decision that stemmed from it. Hale leaned forward, his palms slamming onto the table, his face flushed with frustration. "You are talking about discipline. I am talking about survival. If we hold the line, we die. If we retreat, we live to fight another day." The general's voice trembled, cracking under the strain of his conscience. "You will get them all killed with your stubbornness. I am trying to save lives." The hum of the ventilation fan seemed to grow louder, filling the silence that followed. "No," General Jackson replied, the temperature in the room seeming to drop with his words. His voice was not a shout, but a low rumble of shifting tectonic plates. "It is your hesitation that is killing them. You believe that by retreating, you spare them. But you only allow the enemy to hunt them like frightened game." He stood up slowly, the metal chair scraping harsh against the floor. "War is not about avoiding death. It is about spending it wisely. You are hoarding a currency that is meant to be spent." Hale stared at him, silenced by the cold mathematical brutality of the logic. It was not cruelty. It was a terrifying pragmatism that the general had long forgotten in his desire to be a father to his men rather than their commander. Chapter 4. The Petitioner Before the Golden Statue. The regimental chapel was a broken tooth in the jaw of the firebase. Its roof had been sheared off by stray ordnance days ago, leaving the nave exposed to the weeping, bruised sky of Valadia. Rain slicked the black and white checkered floor, pooling around the base of the central icon. It was a statue of the god emperor Gold Leaf, peeling away to reveal the dull iron beneath his face, scarred by shrapnel, gazing eternally into the horrors of the dark horizon. The wind howled through the jagged gaps in the masonry, creating a mournful, flute-like sound that harmonized with the distant thumping of artillery. Thomas Jackson stood before the image of the master of mankind. He did not prostrate himself in the weeping mud as the Ministorum priests demanded. He did not weep, nor did he light a votive candle with trembling hands. Instead, he stood at the position of attention, his heels locked together, his back ramrod straight, his hat tucked respectfully under his left arm. To the casual observer, it looked like a briefing between two officers of equal rank, separated only by silence and scale. In the flickering light of a few surviving tallow candles, Jackson's face was a mask of austere granite etched with deep lines of contemplation. Commissar Elira Cade watched him from the shadows of the ruined narthex, her hand hovering instinctively over the grip of her bolt pistol. She had come here expecting to find cowardice, or perhaps the whispering madness of heresy that often infected the hopeless. What she saw confused her deeply. The man was not begging for salvation. He was reporting for duty. She strained her ears to catch the low rumble of his voice, expecting the high Gothic chants of the ecclesiarchy. Instead, she heard plain, hard, low Gothic spoken with a strange, archaic cadence. "I do not know your name in this time, nor the doctrines they scream in your shadow." Jackson murmured, his eyes fixed on the statue's stoic gaze. But I recognize the hand of providence when I see it. You have placed these men in the valley of the shadow of death. He paused, the sound of the wind filling the gap. If you are the supreme commander of this theater, then grant me the clarity to execute the maneuver. I do not ask for a miracle. I ask for the strength to do what is necessary. Cade withdrew her hand from her weapon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a mix of religious outrage and a strange, chilling awe. It was technically blasphemy. He spoke to the God Emperor as if he were merely a distant general. Yet the conviction in Jackson's voice carried a weight that the shrieking priests could never muster. It was the faith of a man who believed that God was not a shield, but a sword. As Jackson turned to leave, he spotted Cade in the shadows. He did not startle. He simply nodded, placing his hat back upon his head. The general has a task for me, I assume. He does, Cade replied, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil. She stepped into the light, the rain dripping from the brim of her cap. General Hale has authorized your request. You are to take command of Outpost Delta 9. It is a salient jutting into the enemy's approach vector. Intelligence suggests, and it will be the first to fall when the main assault begins. She paused, searching his eyes for fear. He calls it a suicide mission. He thinks you will die there, Jackson. Jackson adjusted his coat, checking the buttons with methodical precision. Then General Hale is mistaken, Commissar, he said, walking past her into the storm. He sees a grave. I see a killing ground. We move out within the hour. Chapter 5. A lesson in firepower. The horizon of Outpost Delta 9 was a jagged scar of ferrocrete against the oncoming night. But the darkness was alive. It seethed with the clamor of the lost thousands of cultists, their bodies twisted by mutations, and their minds shattered by the whispers of the warp. They surged forward, not as an army, but as a tidal wave of flesh screaming praises to the dark gods, firing autoguns into the air in a display of manic, wasted energy. To the terrified guardsmen of the Validian 88th, looking over the parapets, it looked like the end of the world. Fingers trembled on the triggers of laser guns, set to full auto, desperate to unleash a wall of light to hold back the encroaching nightmare. Selectors to single-shot, Jackson's voice cut through the rising panic, dry and devoid of emotion. He walked the firing line, his cane tapping rhythmically against the metal grating of the trench. I said single shot. Any man I hear firing on automatic will be shot by me personally before the enemy has the chance to kill him. The order was met with bewildered looks. To fight a horde, surely one needed volume of fire, but the sheer terrifying gravity of the old man's presence forced their hands. Reluctantly, with shaking fingers, switches clicked from the rapid fire setting to the single disciplined mode. The hum of the laser guns changed from a hungry whine to a patient predatory purr. The cultists were 300 meters away now, a howling mass of ragged robes and improvised weaponry. They expected the panicked spray of last fire, the erratic resistance of terrified men. Instead, they were met with silence. The outpost was dark, silent as a tomb. Jackson stood at the center of the line, his pocket watch in one hand, his eyes fixed on the second hand ticking relentlessly. He did not look at the monsters charging him. He looked at time itself. Ready, he murmured the word passed down the line by sergeants who were beginning to sweat cold fear. Hundreds of laser guns rose in unison. Aim. The horde was 200 meters out. The stench of unwashed bodies and incense drifted over the walls. Fire. It was not the chaotic rattle of modern warfare. It was a single thunderous crack, a thunderclap of coherent light. 300 last beams struck at the exact same millisecond. The front row of the cultist wave simply evaporated, their torsos vaporized in a sudden wall of thermal energy. The suddenness of the violence, the absolute synchronization, created a shockwave of silence. For a moment, the screaming stopped. "Reload," Jackson said, his voice the only sound in the sudden quiet. The snap of power cells being ejected and replaced rippled down the line like the clicking of a giant clockwork mechanism. Aim. Fire. Crack. Another row of enemies fell cut down like wheat before a scythe. The psychological impact was devastating. The cultists were used to chaos, to the noise of battle. They were not used to this cold, mechanical rhythm. The silence between the volleys was heavier than the shots themselves. It was the silence of judgment. "Hold the rhythm," Jackson roared, his voice rising above the din for the first time, not with anger, but with command. He walked behind a young trooper whose hands were shaking so hard he dropped his power pack. Jackson placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steadying him. "Do not fire at the enemy, son. Fire at your own panic. Control the breath. Squeeze. Repeat." The cultists broke. They did not retreat. They simply collapsed into confusion, their momentum shattered by the impassable wall of disciplined light. They died in heaps, their bodies forming a rampart of meat that only slowed those behind them. Outpost Delta 9 did not fall. It operated like a machine, turning the chaotic fury of the warp into nothing more than data for the casualty reports. Chapter 6. Shadow of the Warp. The victory of discipline was short-lived. As the physical bodies of the cultists smoldered in the kill zone, the air within Outpost Delta 9 shifted. The acrid smell of ozone and burnt meat was suddenly replaced by the cloying scent of sulfur and rotting flowers. The temperature plummeted, frost forming instantly on the barrels of the overheated laser guns, despite the ambient heat of the planet. It was not a weather front, and it was a psychic intrusion. The sorcerers of the enemy, denied their butchery by Jackson's wall of light, had resorted to weapons that bypassed armor entirely. The silence of the outpost was broken not by enemy fire, but by a scream from inside the trench. They're inside the wire. A trooper shrieked, spinning around. To his eyes, the mud-splattered face of his squad mate had elongated into a horned, many-eyed horror, its mouth dripping with acidic bile. He raised his bayonet, eyes wide with madness, ready to impale the man he had shared rations with only hours ago. All along the line, the discipline that Jackson had forged began to fracture like brittle glass. Men clawed at their helmets, weeping as whispers, thousands of them, speaking in the voices of dead loved ones, crawled inside their skulls. The reality of the trench was dissolving into a nightmare landscape of writhing shadows and impossible geometries. Thomas Jackson walked through the waking nightmare, his pace measured and slow. To him, the world was gray, but it was stable. He felt the pressure in the air, the headache threatening to split his temples, but he saw no monsters. He saw only frightened children in uniform fighting phantoms. He did not possess the psychic potential to be a beacon for the warp, nor the imagination to be easily seduced by it. His soul was a fortress of rigid, uncompromising order. Where the warp sought to twist reality, Jackson simply refused to acknowledge it. He approached the screaming trooper who was now grappling with his confused comrade. Jackson did not draw his weapon. He reached out with a gloved hand and gripped the wrist of the hallucinating soldier. The grip was iron hard. "Look at his boots," Private Jackson said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the psychic static like a physical blow. The trooper froze the bayonet, trembling inches from his friend's throat. Demons do not wear standard-issue Munitorum boots. "Look at them." The soldier blinked, tears streaming down his face, fighting the overlay of the warp. He looked down. Through the shimmering haze of the illusion, he saw the muddy, battered leather of an Imperial Guard boot. The grounding detail, so mundane, so undeniably real, shattered the spell. The monster flickered and resolved back into the terrified face of his squad mate. The soldier collapsed, sobbing, dropping his weapon. Jackson released him and moved on, walking down the trench line. "It is a trick of the light," he announced to the men huddled in the mud. "It is smoke and mirrors. Trust your equipment. Trust the man next to you. If it does not bleed, it is not there." Wherever Jackson walked, the madness receded. It was as if his very presence was anathema to the chaos. He was a singularity of absolute reality, a null zone where the laws of physics were enforced by sheer force of will. He touched a shivering sergeant on the shoulder. The man stopped hearing voices. He corrected the aim of a heavy bolter team. The shadows they were firing at had vanished. He did not need prayers or holy water. He simply denied the enemy the right to exist in his perimeter. By the time the psychic storm passed, leaving the soldiers exhausted and pale, a new reverence had taken root in their eyes. They watched Jackson clean a speck of mud from his coat, completely unaffected by the horrors that had nearly broken their minds. They whispered to one another in the dark, passing the word down the line like contraband. "The warp can't touch him," they said. "He doesn't have a soul for them to eat. He's made of stone." The legend of the Stonewall was no longer just about tactics. It was becoming a matter of spiritual survival. Chapter 7. The Crack in Hale. General Vorenus Hale stood alone in the strategic simulacrum chamber, the green glow of the hololith casting long cadaverous shadows across his face. The reports from Outpost Delta 9 lay scattered on the table like accusations. To the High Command, they were commendations, miraculous ratios of kill counts versus ammunition expenditure. To Hale, they were evidence of a soulless atrocity. He read the logs of the single-shot order and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bunker's climate control. Jackson hadn't saved those men. He had turned them into servitors of flesh and blood, stripping away their fear, their humanity, and their instinct to survive, leaving only biological firing mechanisms. He treats them like ammunition. Hale whispered to the empty room, his voice trembling with a mix of indignation and wounded pride. He spends them like bullets. The general poured himself a glass of Amasec, his hands shaking. It wasn't just the morality of it that gnawed at him. It was the humiliation. An outsider, a man with a primitive revolver and a coat from a dead era, had achieved with a single word what Hale had failed to do with entire armored divisions: hold the line. It made Hale feel small, obsolete, and impotent. He looked at the strategic map, his eyes drawn away from the front lines to the huddled masses of civilian refugees trapped in the hab blocks of Zone Secundus. If he could not be the hammer that crushed the enemy, he would be the shield that protected the innocent. That was the duty of an imperial general. It was a seductive thought, a desperate grasp for moral high ground in a war that had none. Hale magnified the map of the rear supply lines. They were the veins of the defense currently reserved for Jackson's ammunition convoys. To hell with his bullets, Hale muttered, a dangerous resolve hardening in his eyes. He tapped the comm bead, bypassing the main tactical net. "Colonel Vane, this is General Hale. Initiate protocol exodus immediately. Mobilize the transport pool." "But sir," the colonel's voice crackled, confused. "That route is designated for the artillery resupply for Sector Delta. If we clutter it with civilian transports..." "Do not cite logistics to me." Colonel Hale snapped, slamming the glass down, shattering it. "There are 50,000 Imperial citizens in those hab blocks. Are we to leave them to the tender mercies of the arch-enemy while we ship crates of power cells, move the trucks? Use the main arterial road. That is a direct order." The order went out, a whisper that would soon become a scream. In the dark, rushing logistics tunnels beneath the city, The heavy engines of Chimera transports and cargo haulers roared to life. They were not heading to the front to reinforce the Stonewall. They were heading cross-current, cutting directly across the delicate rhythmic supply lines that Jackson had established. Hale watched the blue icons of the convoy begin to move on the map, feeling a surge of righteous vindication. He told himself he was saving souls. He did not see the red warning runes blinking on the logistics screen, signaling a massive congestion that would starve the front line of ammunition at the critical hour. He did not see that in his attempt to be a savior, he had just opened the gate for the slaughter. Chapter 8. The Monster of Steel. The ground did not tremble this time. It throbbed. A deep, rhythmic percussion resonated through the soles of the defenders' boots, distinct from the chaotic pounding of artillery. It was the heartbeat of giants. Through the thinning mist, they emerged not as men, but as walking fortifications. The heretic Astartes advanced without cover, their ancient ceramite armor scarred by millennia of war adorned with trophies of skulls and rusted chains. They did not shout war cries like the cultists. They simply marched a wall of midnight blue and gold, their bolters held across their chests like holy relics of destruction. Fire. The command was given, but the result was a horror show of futility. The disciplined volleys of last fire that had vaporized the cultists merely scorched the paint of the Astartes pauldrons, or harmlessly dissipated against their unholy aura. The giants did not even break stride. In response, they raised their bolters. The sound was not a crack, but a series of dull, wet thuds. Inside, the trench bodies did not fall. They detonated. Mass reactive shells punched through flak armor and flesh alike, exploding inside rib cages, turning disciplined soldiers into wet, red mist. The Stonewall was not crumbling, it was being smashed by a sledgehammer. Thomas Jackson stood amidst the spray of gore, his gray coat splattered with the blood of his men. For the first time, a deep frown etched itself into his forehead. He watched a single Astartes backhand, a heavy weapons team sending the gunner flying 20 meters like a rag doll, the heavy bolter crushed in the traitor's grip like tin foil. Faster than cavalry, Jackson muttered to himself, his eyes tracking the terrifying speed of the transhuman monsters. Harder than a fortress. He realized instantly that static defense here was suicide. These were not soldiers. They were main battle tanks shaped like men. Conventional rigidity would only provide them with a stationary target. Execute pattern Jericho. Jackson's voice boomed over the Vox, calm but urgent. Fall back, lure them in. The guardsmen, terrified and broken, scrambled back from the first trench line, fleeing towards the ruined industrial plaza behind them. To the arrogant Astartes, it looked like the inevitable breaking of weak mortals. The giants accelerated their servos, whining as they thumped over the sandbags, eager to slaughter the fleeing prey. They crowded into the plaza, a dense killing zone surrounded by unstable ruins, their heavy boots cracking the pavement. Jackson waited until the plaza was full of the towering monstrosities. He stood on a high balcony overlooking the square, a heavy detonator in his hand, wired not to standard explosives, but to the structural supports of the district's subterranean heat exchangers and mining charges. Gravity, he whispered, watching the lead Chaos Marine look up at him, is the only law you cannot break. He pressed the switch. The ground beneath the plaza didn't just explode. It vanished. A massive sinkhole opened up, swallowing the Astartes into a pit of superheated steam, collapsing ferrocrete and shaped seismic charges. The roar of collapsing earth drowned out even the bolter fire. For a moment, the invulnerable gods of war looked surprised as the planet itself devoured them, burying their ceramite armor under thousands of tons of rock. Chapter 9. Hale's Decision. The tactical map in the command bunker was a tapestry of failure. The red tide of the enemy was not just pushing against the blue line of the Imperial Guard. It was seeping through the cracks, encircling pockets of resistance. But the true horror lay in the rear. The main arterial highway, the lifeline to the Citadel, was a parking lot of burning metal and screaming humanity. General Hale's unauthorized evacuation convoy had stalled hopelessly gridlocked with the ammunition trucks trying to reach the front. The supply chain had strangled itself. On the screens, Hale watched as lighter chaos units, fast-moving raptors and bikers began to strafe the helpless column of refugees. "Command this," is Stonewall Jackson's voice, cut through the static calm as ever, but edged with a terrible finality. The perimeter is breached. Ammunition is critical low. We are initiating a fighting withdrawal to the Citadel, requesting the Valkyrie Bridge be kept open for heavy armor. Hale stared at the Voxcaster. He knew the geography. If Jackson retreated now, his forces would collide with the stalled civilian convoy at the bridge. It would be a slaughterhouse. The retreating soldiers would be trampled by panic, and the civilians would be butchered by the pursuing enemy. There was no room for both the army and the people on that bridge. Hale slowly put on his helmet. It felt heavy like a crown of lead. He looked at Colonel Vane, whose face was gray with the realization of what they had done. "Tell Jackson to proceed to the Citadel," Hale said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But tell him the bridge will be held." He drew his power sword, the weapon humming to life with a crackling blue field. "Mobilize the 7th Division. Turn the command Chimera around. We are going back to the bridge." "General, that is suicide." Jackson's voice returned, breaking protocol. "The enemy vanguard is minutes away. You cannot hold that position against a Legion advance. Fall back to the plan." Hale gripped the Vox handset one last time. He looked at the image of the burning convoy, his mistake, his sin. "Your plan needs time, Jackson, and I have spent that time foolishly." He paused, listening to the distant thunder of the approaching doom. "I will buy you the hours you need. Do not let them catch the civilians. Do not let my death be meaningless." Before Jackson could respond, Hale severed the link. He climbed into his Chimera, the engine roaring like a dying beast. Around him, the men of the 7th Division, his personal honor guard men who had served with him for decades, looked at him. They knew. There were no speeches about glory. There was only the silent understanding of men who knew they were already dead. As the column moved out, heading towards the enemy, Hale looked out at the smoke-choked sky. He was not a tactical genius. He was a flawed man. But tonight, he would be a wall of flesh and iron standing between the innocent and the dark. Chapter 10. The Bridge of Blood. The Valkyrie Bridge was a monolith of Gothic engineering, a kilometer-long span of adamantium and stone, suspended over the churning toxic rapids of the River Lethe. It was the only umbilical cord connecting the outer districts to the safety of the Citadel. Now it was a graveyard in waiting. General Vorenus Hale stood at the precise center of the span, surrounded by the ragged remnants of the 7th Division. Behind them, the tail lights of the last civilian transport faded into the mist safe. Ahead of them, the horizon was a wall of approaching darkness. The ground shook as the enemy armored column Predator tanks and defiled rhinos rolled onto the bridge's approach, their engines growling with the trapped souls of the damned. Hale looked at the men around him. They were not the fresh-faced recruits he had tried to save earlier. These were veterans, scarred and weary men who had followed him through hell and were now prepared to die in it. "Fix bayonets," Hale ordered. He did not yell. The time for shouting was over. He drew his power sword, the energy field crackling with a defiant hiss against the rain. "We do not retreat. We do not surrender. We buy time. Hold them here or die standing." The answer was a collective roar, not of hope, but of pure fatalistic defiance. As the first wave of traitor guards surged onto the bridge, the 7th Division met them with a wall of las fire and serrated steel. The battle was a meat grinder confined to a strip of asphalt 50 meters wide. There was no room for tactics, only butchery. Hale fought like a man possessed, his power sword carving arcs of blue lightning through the press of bodies. He decapitated a howling cultist, sidestepped a chain axe swing from a traitor sergeant, and thrust his blade through the chest of a mutant. He was washing away his sins in a river of blood. But for every enemy he felled, 3 more took their place. The sheer weight of the chaos push was driving them back inch by bloody inch. A chaos dreadnought stomped onto the bridge, its assault cannon spinning up, turning the defenders into red mist. Hale took a bolt round to the shoulder, spinning him around, dropping him to one knee. Gasping for air, blood bubbling from his lips, Hale looked up. The enemy was everywhere. The dreadnought was looming over him, its claw raising for the killing blow. The bridge was packed tight with the enemy, a perfect concentration of hatred. Hale smiled a grim, bloody rictus. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to bait the trap. He reached into his coat, his fingers closing around the remote detonator, linked to the melta-charges rigged along the suspension cables. "I am sorry," he whispered, not to the enemy, but to the son he had lost. "I'm coming." He depressed the plunger. From a high ridge kilometers away, Thomas Jackson lowered his electro-binoculars. He watched as the center of the bridge bloomed into a sphere of blinding white fire. The sound reached him seconds later, a crack that sounded like the planet's spine snapping. The central span overloaded with thousands of traitor troops, and their heavy armor groaned and sheared away from the pylons. With a slow, majestic finality, the entire structure collapsed into the abyss below, taking General Hale and the vanguard of the Chaos Army with it. The enemy advance was severed instantly, their momentum crushed under the weight of gravity. Jackson stood in the silence that followed the roar. He reached up and touched the brim of his battered kepi, tipping it slightly towards the rising plume of dust and smoke. It was a gesture of old-world chivalry, rare in the grim darkness of the far future. "He made many mistakes," Jackson said to the wind, his voice devoid of judgment. He hesitated. He faltered. But in the end, he died like a soldier. He turned back to his waiting staff, his face returning to its mask of stone. "The enemy is clustered. Their vanguard is destroyed. Prepare the artillery. We begin the next phase." Chapter 11. The Ascension of Rumor. The Citadel was meant to be a place of somber preparation, a tomb where men waited to die. Instead, it had become a cathedral of feverish whispers. The news of General Hale's sacrifice at the Valkyrie Bridge had not demoralized the troops. It had transfigured them. The story had traveled faster than Vox transmissions, mutating with every retelling, until the truth was buried beneath layers of desperate mythology. Hale had not simply died to save civilians or to correct a tactical error. In the eyes of the battered Validian 88th, the general had thrown himself into the abyss to save him, to save the Stonewall. The general saw it. A trooper whispered his hands, wrapped in bloody bandages, as he huddled over a promethium stove. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a mix of fatigue and religious ecstasy. He saw the aura around Jackson. He knew. You don't sacrifice a high command general for a colonel unless that colonel is touched by the golden throne. Around him, heads nodded in solemn agreement. The logic of the administratum did not apply here. The hierarchy of rank had been replaced by the hierarchy of the soul. If a general died for Jackson, then Jackson was worth more than a general. Jackson was a vessel. Commissar Elira Cade walked through the marshalling yards, her boots crunching on the gravel. She should have been executing people. By the strict letter of the Imperial Creed, What she was witnessing was borderline idolatry. She saw men carving the name Jackson into the wooden stocks of their laser guns right next to the Aquila. She saw a ragged banner being hoisted up a comms tower, not bearing the regiment's colors, but a crude charcoal drawing of a stone wall standing against a red tide. They were not praying for the Emperor to save them anymore. They were praying for Jackson to lead them. She stopped beside a heavy weapons team. The gunner was polishing his autocannon with a tenderness usually reserved for a lover. He had painted a new litany on the barrel shield, "The wall does not break." Cade gripped the pommel of her sword, her knuckles white. "Trooper," she said, her voice sharp, "that is not an approved ecclesiarchy prayer." The gunner looked up. There was no fear in his eyes, only a strange, terrifying calm. "With respect, Commissar," he said softly. "The priests are on the ships. The Emperor is on Terra, but the Stonewall is here." Cade looked at him then, at the thousands of other faces in the yard. They were no longer the terrified conscripts who had routed at Sector 4. They were fanatics. They were ready to throw themselves into a meat grinder if Jackson simply pointed a finger. To break this illusion now would be to shatter their morale completely. They needed a god they could touch. She released her grip on her sword and stepped back. "Ensure the barrel is oiled, Trooper," she said quietly. "We fight at dawn." She was allowing the heresy to take root, trading her soul's purity for a chance at victory. It was a bargain the Inquisition would burn her for. But for tonight, the lie was stronger than the truth. Chapter 12. The Defense in Depth Plan. The command sanctum of the Citadel did not smell of fear. It smelled of sacred machine oil and the ozone sting of overheated logic engines. In the center of the room, a massive three-dimensional hololith projected the ruined cityscape of Validia in flickering crimson light. Magos Oryx 7 hovered over the display, his mechadendrites twitching with agitated binary chatter. The tech priest was a tapestry of brass and wire, his organic eyes long replaced by glowing optical sensors that whirred as they processed the tactical geometry. He was not looking at a city. He was calculating a demolition. "The probability of holding the outer wall is 0.04%, Oryx 7 intoned his voice, a metallic rasp synthesized through a vox grill. "The structural integrity of the localized ferrocrete is insufficient to withstand a focused assault by Astartes-grade heavy weaponry. We must reinforce the perimeter." "No," Thomas Jackson replied. He stood on the opposite side of the table, his hands resting on the cool metal edge. He looked small compared to the towering cyborg, yet his presence filled the room. "We will not reinforce the wall. We will let them breach it." He reached into the hologram, his hand passing through the ghostly red buildings. "A wall is a challenge, Magos. It invites them to smash it. We do not want to stop them. We want to guide them." Jackson's finger traced a path through the labyrinth of the industrial sector. "We will create a funnel. Collapse these 3 hab blocks here, here, and here." He pointed to key structural supports. "Leave the central avenue open. It will look like a weakness, a tactical error. The enemy commander is arrogant. He will see an open throat and try to rip it out. He will pour his heaviest units into this channel." Oryx 7 processed the data, his internal cogitators spinning up. "You are suggesting a killbox simulation on a macro scale. You wish to turn the city interior into a weapon." "I wish to turn it into a meat grinder," Jackson corrected softly. "We trade space for blood. Every street corner must be an ambush. Every pile of rubble must hide a meltagun. We will defend in depth. They will pay for every inch of ground with a bucket of blood, and when they finally reach the center, they will have nothing left to fight with." Hours later, Jackson was not in the bunker. He was down in the ruins, walking the intended kill zone with the obsession of an architect, inspecting a foundation. The air was thick with dust as combat engineers worked silently to rig explosives and position barricades. Jackson stopped at a heavy bolter nest, concealed behind a pile of shattered masonry. He crouched down, checking the line of sight. He stayed there for a long moment, squinting down the barrel. "Move it," he said to the gunner crew. 3 inches to the left. Lower the traverse." "Sir," the sergeant asked, confused. "The field of fire is better here. If you leave it here, you are exposed to the sniper angles from the cathedral spire." Jackson explained, pointing a gloved finger at a distant ruin. "Move it left. You lose 10 degrees of vision, but you gain survival. And I need you alive long enough to empty that magazine." The sergeant stared at the spire, realizing the blind spot he had missed. He nodded, pale-faced, and began to shift the heavy weapon. Jackson moved on his pocket watch, ticking loudly in the momentary silences between the construction noise. Tick, tick, tick. It was the heartbeat of the defense. He checked the tension of tripwires. He adjusted the angle of a claymore mine so it would shred legs rather than armor. He was not just planning a battle. He was composing a symphony of violence, where every note had to be played at the exact right moment. The sheer level of micromanagement would have been insulting from any other officer. From Jackson, it felt like a blessing. The men saw him touching the sandbags, and they felt the walls grow stronger. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined city, the trap was set. The citadel looked vulnerable, its walls breached and crumbling. But inside, it was a coiled viper. Jackson stood on the final defensive line, looking down the long, empty avenue he had prepared. Magos Oryx 7 appeared beside him, his optical sensors glowing in the twilight. "The calculations are complete." Colonel the Magos word. "The trap is logically sound. However, it relies on the enemy taking the bait. It relies on their rage overriding their tactical cogitators." Jackson pulled out his watch, checking the time one last time. He snapped the lid shut with a satisfying click. "Do not worry, Magos. The devil is always in a hurry, and I have left the door wide open." Chapter 13. The Red Tide. The silence of the trap was broken not by a shout, but by a chant that seemed to bleed from the stones themselves. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. It started as a whisper in the minds of the defenders, then grew into a roar that shook the dust from the ruined ceiling of the citadel. Down the central avenue, the one Jackson had left deliberately open, the red tide poured in. It was a slurry of traitor Astartes, blood-soaked cultists and demon engines. But at their head marched a nightmare made manifest. Kargoth, the Red Psalm, a chaos lord, of such swollen power that the air around him boiled into red mist. Kargoth did not run. He stomped his Terminator armor decorated with the flayed skins of a dozen planetary governors. He carried a demon maul that pulsed with the heartbeat of a dying star, and a combi bolter that spat explosive death with every step. He was a creature of absolute unthinking violence. He saw the open street not as a tactical error, but as an invitation to the slaughter he craved. "Jackson," he bellowed, his voice a grinding tectonic shift that shattered the remaining windows in the sector. "Bring me your head, old man. I will mount it on the prow of my flagship." High above in the command post, Thomas Jackson watched the monster advance through his binoculars. The lens magnified the horror, the glowing runes on Kargoth's armor, the aura of heat that incinerated raindrops before they could touch him. Most men would have frozen in terror. Jackson merely checked his pocket watch. "He is early," Jackson noted dryly to Magos Oryx 7. "Impatience is a sin even for a demon." He picked up the Vox handset. "Battery Alpha, hold fire. Let him reach the intersection. Do not engage until he is committed." On the ground, The discipline of the Validian 88th was pushed to its breaking point. They watched the giant approach, shrugging off last fire as if it were a mild annoyance. A chimera transport roared out from a side street to intercept him. Kargoth didn't even slow down. He swung his maul, the impact crumpling the armored vehicle like a tin can, flipping the 40-ton tank into the air in a shower of sparks and burning fuel. The soldiers in the trenches gripped their weapons until their knuckles turned white, praying that the order to fire would come before the monster reached them. Kargoth reached the central plaza, a kill zone cluttered with heavy ferrocrete barricades and the wreckage of a collapsed manufactorum. To the Chaos Lord, these were merely obstacles to be smashed. He saw the main defensive line behind a massive, partially destroyed generator block. With a roar of fury, he charged, intending to smash through the building to get to the prey behind it. He lowered his shoulder, wreathed in warp fire, and slammed into the generator block with the force of a meteor. The structure groaned and exploded outward, bricks and steel raining down. Kargoth emerged from the dust triumphant, roaring his victory. But as the dust settled, he realized his mistake. The building had not been a shield for the defenders. It had been a blinder for him. By destroying it, he had cleared the line of sight for the 3 Basilisk artillery tanks Jackson had positioned at the far end of the avenue, leveled for direct fire. Now, Jackson whispered. The Basilisks fired. At point-blank range, the Earthshaker shells didn't arc. They flew straight and true, slamming into Kargoth's chest with the force to crack a mountain. The explosion was absolute, engulfing the Chaos Lord in a sun-hot sphere of destruction. Chapter 14. The Unbroken Wall. The smoke from the point-blank artillery barrage hung in the air like a shroud, thick, oily, and reeking of sulfur. For a heartbeat, a desperate hope seized the defenders. Had the monster been unmade? Had the sheer kinetic force of the Earthshaker shells erased the stain of the warp? Then a low, guttural laugh vibrated through the soles of their boots, a sound deeper than the rumble of the tanks. A hand stripped of its ceramite gauntlet and skin, revealing raw, warp-fused muscle and black bone, punched through the smoke. Kargoth emerged. He was a ruin of a warrior, his Terminator plate cracked and fusing to his boiling flesh, half his face burned away, to reveal a grinning, wet skull. He was not dead. He was merely insulted. The damage seemed only to stoke the furnace of his rage. Is that all? Kargoth roared, blood spraying from his ruined mouth, acidic spittle sizzling on the pavement. He did not charge with tactical grace. He rampaged. He ignored the last fire that peppered his exposed flesh like rain. He smashed through the sandbags of the final command post, throwing elite stormtroopers aside like broken toys. He was an unstoppable force of nature, a hurricane of gore and hatred that had finally reached the eye of the storm. There, standing amidst the debris of the command center, was Thomas Jackson. There was nothing left between the demon thing and the colonel. No bodyguards, no walls, no tricks. Jackson stood in the open. He did not draw his sword. He did not reach for his revolver. He simply stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed yet immovable. He watched the approaching avatar of murder with the detached curiosity of a man observing a natural disaster. The sheer audacity of it, the absolute refusal to flinch or show terror, caused Kargoth to falter. The Chaos Lord skidded to a halt mere meters away, his chain axe revving hungrily, the teeth choked with meat. He expected fear. He fed on it. It was the wine of the dark gods. But there was none here, only a gray, silent void. Why do you not run? Kargoth hissed, the warp spasm twitching in his remaining eye. The question was involuntary, ripped from him by the sheer wrongness of the situation. I am the end of days. I am the Red Psalm. Your soul should be screaming. Jackson looked up at the towering monstrosity, his blue eyes clear and cold as a winter morning. He did not shout. He spoke with the quiet authority of a schoolmaster correcting a petulant child. "You have strength," Jackson said, his voice cutting through the noise of the dying battle. "But you have no purpose. You are a fire without a hearth. You burn, but you build nothing. That is why you have already lost." The confusion on Kargoth's face lasted only a second, but in the calculus of war, a second is an eternity. It was the moment of hesitation that Jackson had bought with his soul's stillness. From the shadows of a ruined pillar, Commissar Elira Cade stepped out, a melt-a-gun braced against her shoulder, the barrel glowing white-hot. For the Emperor, she screamed, unleashing a beam of superheated fusion directly into the fissure the artillery had opened in Kargoth's chest plate. The thermal lance cooked the Chaos Lord's internal organs, boiling his blood in his veins. He staggered back, roaring in agony, raising his axe for a final desperate killing blow on the man who had humiliated him. That was when the logic engines of Magos Oryx 7 completed their final countdown. Judgment delivered the Magos, intoned from the darkness of the gantry above. The seismic charges wired to the cathedral's vaulted ceiling detonated in a precise sequence. It wasn't just rubble that fell. It was the main support beams of the entire sector's roof. Hundreds of tons of consecrated ferrocrete, reinforced adamantium, and marble plummeted down with the weight of divine wrath. Kargoth looked up, his roar of defiance cut short as the mountain fell upon him. The impact shook the city to its foundations, a thunderclap that signaled the end of the storm. When the dust finally settled, there was no Chaos Lord. There was only a massive cairn of rubble, a tomb built in an instant. And standing calmly at its base, brushing a speck of dust from his gray coat, was Stonewall Jackson. Chapter 15. The Price of Victory. The silence that followed the collapse of the cathedral vault was not peaceful. It was the ringing emptiness of a world that had screamed itself hoarse. The dust settled slowly, coating the ruins of Valadia in a shroud of gray powder, burying the dead of both sides indiscriminately. The kill box had worked. The heart of the Chaos assault had been crushed under thousands of tons of rock, and without their lord, the remaining cultists broke and scattered like roaches exposed to light. But the victory had been purchased with a currency of blood that stained the streets knee-deep. Thomas Jackson walked through the aftermath, his cane sinking into the mire of ash and mud. He did not celebrate. There was no joy in his eyes, only the weary accounting of a butcher who has finished a long day's work. He passed the bodies of the Valedian 88th boys who had died holding the choke points he had drawn on a map. He stopped occasionally to close the eyes of a staring corpse or to straighten a twisted limb. To Jackson, they were not just units of attrition. They were men who had executed his will, and he owed them the dignity of acknowledgement. The survivors watched him pass, their faces blackened with soot, leaning on their cooling lasguns. They did not cheer. They simply watched with a reverence usually reserved for the statues of saints. He made his way to the edge of the abyss where the Valkyrie Bridge had once stood. Recovery teams equipped with grav chutes were already hauling debris from the jagged banks of the River Lethe. They had found something. Jackson approached the stretcher where a solitary object lay, covered by a tattered regimental banner. He lifted the cloth. There was not much left of General Vorenus Hale, only a shattered breastplate and a hand still gripping the hilt of a broken power sword. The man who had feared death so much that he nearly lost the war had in the end embraced it to save them all. "Bring him to the center of the square," Jackson ordered softly. "We will bury him now, not later. Now." A small crowd gathered in the ruined plaza. It was a motley congregation: battered guardsmen, the surviving stormtroopers, Commissar Cade, and the hovering Clickenform, of Magos Oryx 7. There were no Ministorum priests left alive to conduct the rites. The duty fell to the ranking officer. Jackson stood by the makeshift grave dug hastily into the cratered asphalt. He removed his kepi, holding it against his chest. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the buildings, carrying the scent of burning flesh and the ozone tang of the earlier bombardment. Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was incredibly old, the pages yellowed and brittle. He did not open it to the imperial litanies. He opened it to a passage from a world that had been forgotten 38,000 years ago. He began to read, his voice low and steady. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. The words drifted over the silent soldiers. They had never heard this specific scripture. It did not speak of purging the unclean or burning the heretic. It spoke of peace of a race finished, of a rest earned. To their ears, attuned to the harsh dogma of the 40th millennium, it sounded like the secret high speech of the emperor himself. Commissar Cade watched the faces of the men. She saw tears carving tracks through the grime on their cheeks. She saw them making the sign of the Aquila, whispering the words, "Crown of Righteousness," as if it were a new battle cry. She knew deep down that Jackson was reading from a forbidden or unknown text. In any other circumstance, she would have executed him for spreading unsanctioned lore. But here, standing over the grave of a hero, surrounded by men who had walked through hell, the heresy felt like the only truth that mattered. Dust to dust, Jackson finished closing the book. He looked at the grave of the man who had disagreed with him on everything, save for the final, most important thing. Rest well, General. You held the bridge. Chapter 16. The Judgment of the Inquisition. The black ships did not descend with the roar of thunder. They arrived with the silence of a funeral procession. The skies above Validia, recently cleared of the warp storm, were now choked by the ominous, angular silhouettes of the Inquisition. The survivors of the 88th Regiment stood in the courtyard of the Citadel, their armor battered and scorched, watching as the ramp of the lead gunship hissed open. A chill wind swept through the plaza, colder than any unnatural frost brought by the Chaos Sorcerers. Inquisitor Lord Valerius stepped onto the cracked pavement. He was a figure of terrifying majesty, clad in power armor, engraved with holy script, a heavy cloak of crimson velvet trailing behind him. He was flanked by a retinue of scribe servitors and masked stormtroopers, whose hell guns hummed with lethal intent. Valerius did not look at the ruins or the piles of dead Chaos Marines. His bionic eye whirred and clicked, scanning the faces of the Validian soldiers. He saw the unauthorized sigils etched into their armor, the gray wall, the old world script. He smelled the stench of idolatry. "Kneel," Valerius commanded. His voice was amplified by vox emitters echoing like the voice of a wrathful god. The entire regiment dropped to one knee, except for one man. Thomas Jackson stood by the strategic table studying a holographic map of the sector, seemingly oblivious to the arrival of the most feared authority in the Imperium. Valerius's human eye narrowed. He marched towards the command post, his retinue parting the sea of kneeling soldiers. Commissar Elira Cade stepped into his path, her hand raised in a salute that was respectful but firm. "My Lord Inquisitor Cade," said, her voice steady, though sweat beaded on her forehead. "The sector is secured. The enemy is purged." "Is it?" Valerius sneered, gesturing to the troops. "I see a regiment that worships a man commissar. I see icons that are not of the Ministorum. I see a heresy of the subtle kind, the kind that rots the soul from within." He pointed a gloved finger at Jackson's back. "That man is a false idol. He has replaced the Emperor in their hearts. The punishment for this is death. For him and for those who follow him." Cade did not flinch. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times since the battle ended. "He is not an idol, my lord. He is a relic." She lowered her voice, stepping closer to the Inquisitor. "He claims no divinity. He attributes every victory to divine providence. He has turned a routed mob into a weapon of fanatical lethal efficiency. If you kill him, you destroy the morale of this entire crusade front. If you use him, you gain a weapon that the arch-enemy fears." Valerius paused his hand, hovering near the rosette of his office. He looked past Cade to Jackson. The old man finally turned around. Jackson did not look fearful. He looked at the Inquisitor with the appraising eye of a general inspecting a new logistical variable. "You are the political officer for this theater, I assume?" Jackson asked calmly. "Your supply lines are late, sir, but your timing for the cleanup is impeccable." The sheer audacity of the statement silenced the courtyard. Valerius stared at Jackson, searching for the taint of chaos, the madness of the warp. He found neither. He found only an absolute terrifying sanity, a rigidity of mind that was harder than adamantium. To execute him would be to create a martyr. To let him live was a risk. Valerius made his decision a decision of cold pragmatism. "You are dangerous," Colonel Valerius hissed. "But the galaxy is burning, and I am short on walls." He turned to Cade. "He lives, but he is mine. You will watch him, Commissar. If he deviates from the Imperial Creed by a single syllable, if he falters, if he tries to become a king, you will put a bolt round through his skull. Do you understand?" "Understood, my lord," Cade replied, exhaling a breath she didn't know she was holding. Later that night, Jackson stood alone on the balcony of the Citadel. The Inquisition ships were leaving, taking the prisoners and the taint of the warp with them. Jackson looked up at the stars, not the stars of Earth, but the strange burning constellations of the 41st millennium. He looked at the great rift, the scar that tore the galaxy in half. He finally understood the scale of the conflict. This was not a skirmish in Virginia. This was not a campaign for a nation. This was a war for the survival of the human soul. He adjusted his kepi, pulling the brim low over his eyes. He reached into his pocket and touched the cold metal of his pocket watch. "It is a very large war," Jackson whispered to the dark, "but the strategy remains the same." He turned and walked back into the light. The Stonewall was ready. In General Hale's shoes, would you choose to retreat to save your forces, or fight to the death to support Jackson? Let us know in the comments below.